Well, have you seen this? Turns out the hits just keep on coming for General Motors. GM now announcing 6 new recalls, more than 7.5 million more vehicles. Well, that brings the total of all GM cars and trucks that have been recalled so far to 25 million. That's roughly how many cars GM builds in 2 years. The company says the cost of fixing all these recalls is really starting now to add up to the tune of $2.5 billion so far. So what does this mean for us and for GM? Charles Gasparino, senior correspondent with the Fox Business Network. Charlie, if they are actually recalling more cars and vehicles than they're building, that's really pathetic.
Right. And, I've seen a number that, they haven't sold that many cars since 2005. I mean, that the total number since 2005 to 2013 is something in the neighborhood of 30 million cars. So this just gives you an indication of the scope of this thing. The other thing is this, and I will say this, I'm not saying that GM should be put out of business, but we should point out that the Justice Department has put companies out of business for a lot less. If you think about it, Arthur Andersen didn't quite kill anybody, neither did Enron, yet Arthur Andersen was put out of business for being part of the Enron fraud. I mean, this is pretty staggering that people who have died at a fairly large clip. I mean, this is just like, 2 mistakes. There's a pattern here. And, and that this company still exists. We should also point out GM was bailed out massively by the federal government. The government is loath to put companies out of business that employ people. That's why they're doing this. That's why they're keeping them around. But, the scope of this thing keeps getting worse. And I will tell you this. I do know that the board of directors of GM has reached out to attorneys. They feel that the litigation cost of this alone could be pretty damaging, where, the company itself isn't out of the woods yet in terms of its survivability. We should point out the stock price has not reflected that. If you look at the stock price, it's fairly stable through all this. You bring in Ken Feinberg to basically figure out a way to pay off some of the people that were hurt here. Ken Feinberg is known as a guy, he's done other things like the BP oil well spill. He's a guy that gives out money, but he also protects the corporate asset as well. So I think the market's saying that's a positive thing. But I'm telling you, the size and scope of this thing has trouble written all over it. And I do know the board of directors is worried about litigation.
Well, look, at Mary Barra, they've got to start dealing with this. And look, you talk about Ken Feinberg. You've got the payouts $2 million to $7.8 million. That was to a 10-year-old who is left a paraplegic, apparently, because of their first ignition switch problem. Now you got a second one. They think so far, the death toll, they say 13, climbing now 7 more crashes. So what does this company do? And should the Department of Justice, if it finds criminality, what do? Put GM into receivership or some type of authority?
Here's the thing. The Obama administration is loath to put businesses like this out of business. I mean, and it's not just the Obama administration. We should point out, following Enron, when Arthur Andersen was deemed to, aid and abet Enron and its massive fraud back in 2000 and 2001, the Justice Department has not really gone after businesses themselves to put major employers out of business. But, you never know when this thing starts heating up. I will say this, Eric, if you could show that this ignition thing occurred significantly before the bailouts, what does that mean for the way GM was forced into bankruptcy and bailed out by the federal government? Can that thing get unwound in any way? I mean, this starts opening up. I'm not a lawyer. You got to get a lawyer on for this. But I do know that the board of directors of GM is worried. They've reached out to counsel because they see a potential never-ending string of litigation here, depending on how far this goes back.
Well, you got 25 million recall. I mean, just astounding. And they should be worried. Charlie Gasparino, thank you so much for your insight today.
You got it.
Of course.